Infrastructure or culture? What comes first in creating bike-friendly cities? Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, urban planning and many more. I'm very honored to introduce you to the newest episode of Urbcast, which will be devoted to the bicycle urbanism, and my guest will be James Thoem, who is the CEO of Copenhagenize. Copenhagenize is a multidisciplinary go-to team if it comes to bicycle urbanism, but not only. Its founder, Danish-Canadian urbanist Michael Caldwell Andersen, was the one who successfully promoted the Danish or especially Copenhagen biking culture abroad. Now Copenhagenize is working with city mayors from all over the world, from Americas to Russia. Especially there was one interesting city that we'll be mentioning in our discussion from Russia, to help the mayors of the cities making their cities better places to live. A big part of it is devoted to planning efficient biking infrastructure, but not only. You will be able to hear this inspiring conversation, and especially we will try to think about what special can Copenhagen share with other cities. Because Copenhagenize is, as I understand it, to bring a piece of Copenhagen and transplant it to some other city. But I think that, as it will be clear in our discussion, we need to avoid copy-pasting, and we can't just transport one piece of advice from one city and just put it in the other city and just expect that everything will be working perfectly, because of course that obviously it's not the truth. So today we will focus on the evolution of the bicycle culture 2.0, as well as we'll talk about, how can we Copenhagenize other cities without copying and pasting. I am extremely happy to be able to talk to James from Copenhagenize, especially that Copenhagenize is something that was familiar to me for many years. Even before I moved to Copenhagen, I knew that there is such a cool initiative that it's helping to promote bicycle-friendly design of our cities. It was just a big honor and also a big pleasure to get to know the story behind the Copenhagenize, as well as the current projects and developments of the team. One thing that came as a surprise to me during our conversation is that when we've been talking about the cargo bikes and the influence of cargo bikes on our cities, James mentioned a very positive example, a role model from the Polish city of Gdynia. And since I'm very familiar with this city, I was just very proud to hear that the Polish city is actually it's so successful if it comes to cargo bikes and managing the cargo bike system that it can share this idea with other cities. I hope that you will learn a lot from this bicycle urbanism episode and that we will answer to this main question. What comes first, infrastructure or culture? Welcome to my podcast and thank you for being part of Urbcast. I'm very honored.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's great to finally be here and finally connect with you. I've been following your podcast for a while and listening to some of your other interviews, so it's good to finally sit down with you and discuss all things bicycle urbanism.
When you think about Copenhagen and especially about the urbanism and bicycle part, of course, it's very famous due to a very good PR. And I think that Copenhagenize was always a part of it, of sharing the idea behind the sustainable mobility in Copenhagen. I was just wondering how to start this conversation, and I thought that the best way would be on this more personal note. I know that as well as me, you also have been studying in Sweden. So what made you come to Copenhagen and then join Copenhagenize? I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's a good question and one I hear fairly often. And I guess you got to first ask what made me come to Sweden in the first place. Because if you can maybe tell by my accent, I'm actually not Swedish, not Danish, but rather Canadian. So I was born and raised in Ontario, near to Toronto. And I studied in Toronto for a while and I studied urban studies there. And after graduating, I was really passionate about the field. But I really realized that if I wanted to keep studying cities, I had to look elsewhere. So I applied to programs in Vancouver and Montreal. But I was lucky enough to have a passport from a former European state, the UK. So I was able to pack up and move to Sweden. And in Stockholm, I found sort of the right mix of a program that was an urban studies, urban planning program, but a bit more policy oriented rather than design oriented. And then shortly after graduating there, I had visited Copenhagen a couple of times by that point, and I'd always loved the city. So once I got the opportunity to intern here at Copenhagenize, I actually jumped on it. And I moved down right away and haven't looked back since.
You probably have been attracted with the design, with the life-sized city, so to say, that Copenhagen might be associated with. And you also said that you joined here at Copenhagenize in Copenhagen as an intern. What made you being interested in Copenhagenize in the first place, that you applied for first at the intern here?
I think it was definitely that Copenhagenize has always been rather good at telling a story and presenting the benefits of living in a city where the bicycle is considered a normal mode of transportation, and sort of sharing that widely and making it seem almost obvious, almost second nature. That there should be no debate about this, but rather, look, when you accommodate cycling through safe and comfortable connected infrastructure, it just becomes so natural. And that's one of the many things that attracted me to the city, both as a visitor in the first place, but also eventually as a resident. Yeah, it's a great city. Of course, it's easy to cycle throughout the whole city. It's easy to get around. It's a good scale. It's rather small compared to Toronto, for instance, also rather small in footprint compared to Stockholm as well. But that doesn't mean that it's quiet or boring. There's actually a lot of street life here. And in no small part, I think the bicycle and the presence of the bicycle infrastructure has actually fed into that street life. You know, when you're walking down the street in Copenhagen, there's a certain sort of human feel when you see dozens, if not hundreds of faces rushing by you, rather than hundreds of metal boxes rushing by you. So there's a really specific feel and atmosphere in the city streets here in Copenhagen that really attracted me to the city and has made me choose to settle down here and have a family.
And of course, in the later part of our conversation, we'll also talk about the specifics and the attractive design of Copenhagen that you are trying to export as well as this design tool to all different cities around the world. But before that, I assume that my listeners are equally interested in the story behind the Copenhagenize as I am. So how did it all start with Copenhagenize? When did you join? And can you just share a brief story behind the whole idea being born here in Copenhagen?
Yeah, of course. Well, Copenhagenize is actually a very 21st century company, you could say. If you look at the foundations of the company, we were founded by our colleague Michael Caldwell as really a photo blog in the beginning. And he was documenting how people were cycling through the city dressed in everyday clothes. You know, people in casual clothing, people in suits and ties, in high heels and dresses, and showing that you can actually dress like a normal person and ride a bike at the same time. And that caught on. That blog became quite popular. And then he started, really highlighting the infrastructure that made that possible through the blog Copenhagenize. And then from there, we sort of evolved into a consultancy. And when I came on, there was a sort of turning point within the company where we really started to work as urban planners with a couple other colleagues that are still now running the Montreal office and the Paris office, consulting cities, developing bicycle transportation plans, bicycle network plans, and whatnot to help other cities learn from Copenhagen. And I think that's really been sort of from the really founding of the company, consistent theme has been, how can cities learn from Copenhagen? Not really how can they just make themselves exactly replicas of Copenhagen, but rather what are the sort of foundational or the elemental components of Copenhagen that make it a great cycling city. It's not that the bicycle is not necessarily something particularly Danish, not at all, but it's actually the infrastructure. And when you can learn that and recognize that, you can also realize how that infrastructure can fit into cities all over the world, whether it's Warsaw or Toronto or Abu Dhabi. So yeah, and now as a company, we've developed with 3 offices, one here in Copenhagen, one also in Paris, and then one in Montreal. We've been working all around the world, from Kazakhstan to California, Australia to Hamburg, helping cities become more bicycle friendly. We primarily do it through urban planning and design, but also through communications and education. And sort of what underlines all the work that we do is the idea that the bicycle is a legitimate mode of transportation, just like the bus, just like the car, just like the train, just like the pedestrian. And once you recognize that, then you need to also recognize that you need to build the infrastructure to accommodate it. And you need to maintain the infrastructure to accommodate it. You also need to talk about it in a constructive way, rather than sort of a paternalistic, scolding way saying, hey, cyclists, you better behave, but rather say, hey, thanks for cycling. Or, encourage cycling as if it's second nature, or as if it's a natural and accessible and common mode of transportation. And then sort of with that approach, we have been lucky enough to work with cities all around the world and experience many different contexts, but still with the same sort of idea in mind that we have, that we're aiming towards making the city more bicycle friendly.
I'm happy that you've mentioned the main founder of Copenhagenize, Michael Caldwell, because I'm a big fan of him and especially of the way he promoted Copenhagen as a bike-friendly city, and also by publishing his book, Copenhagenize, which was translated into many languages, including my native language, Polish. It was called Be Like Copenhagen. And I know that the book was also, or probably still is, very popular in Poland, and that other cities are being inspired by Copenhagen. And I'm also happy that you've mentioned already that it is not about copy-pasting the ideas from Copenhagen. It's rather being more inspired by the elements and the puzzle pieces that worked in this context. I wanted to also talk a bit about the bicycle culture, and especially something that you've mentioned, which is called precisely Bicycle Culture 2.0. And let me just quote this, that there is a little standing in the way of advancing the evolution of the Bicycle Culture 2.0, because modern urban planning is often singular in its focus on technical models and solutions, statistics, impact assessment, and cost. But Copenhagenize design company prefers to place the primary focus on the human nature in your work. And we think about the bicycle user first and design from there, whatever the city. How would you describe this challenge that you have, that we are in the midst of the omnipresent approach towards, I hope it's less and less, but still car-centric approach to designing our cities? And here you come with this human-centric approach with a bike. How are you managing to kind of push your bike-friendly agenda?
It's a good question. And we're always struggling to find different ways to push the agenda, but we are seeing momentum, pardon the pun, around the world in terms of recognizing the bicycle as a legitimate mode of transportation. And you could say that maybe bicycle urbanism 2.0 is really about reaching that point where it is normalized. If 1.0 was characterized by the era of critical mass demonstrations and aggressive bicycle messengers and stickers saying one less car, 2.0 could be characterized by the resident cycling down the street in high heels or in a suit and tie, and showing that this has really got into a point that it's not really anything special anymore. It's not really even an identity marker. And that's really what we're aiming for, is the normalization of cycling. And in pursuing that, of course, we're running into a lot of the familiar challenges with standards and different metrics common with transportation engineering. And that is a challenge, but we're also seeing more and more, the politics of urban mobility are also changing, where we're starting to see politicians being elected on various levels of government that are realizing that something is wrong with the way that the cities have been designed for the automobile for the past 50 plus years, and sort of asking new questions about how to efficiently use our city spaces, our city streets, whether that's by building trial bike lanes and having them, just tested, prototyped for a half year or a season and then developing from there, or whether it's, implementing things like bike share systems or cycle logistics hubs to really show that the bicycle can serve a wide range of roles and a wide range of users in the streets. And we like to think a lot about the user, because it's really important, like any other design aspect, whether it's a phone or a chair or a table or what have you. The design of the infrastructure has to be in a way that makes it very intuitive, not just for the bicycle rider, but for all road users, for car drivers, for pedestrians, for cyclists, and so on. And I think that's one of the things that we're really inspired by here in Copenhagen, is that the infrastructure is so simple in a way and so intuitive. And I recognize for the listeners out there that, especially working within mobility planning, simple does not mean easy, but it's something to aim towards. So here, when you, no matter what sort of road user you are, when you turn the corner, it's pretty quick and easy to read the road. That, as a pedestrian, you belong here. As a cyclist, you belong there. And as a motorist, you belong there. There's no questions. There's no user manual that you need to sort of pull out depending on which street you're going down. It's very, very straightforward. And that is actually one of the main elements that we take from Copenhagen and we keep with us as we work internationally, making sure that the infrastructure is designed in a way that is safe and comfortable, but also intuitive.
good design of cities, especially if it comes to bicycle urbanism, is about the intuition, so that you can basically feel comfortable and you are just finding your way very easily. And this is a very interesting approach. And you have also mentioned the infrastructure that should be kind of a simple solution, or simple in the terms of construction and so on. Every time I talk about bicycles, and this is of course like a very present topic here in Denmark, but not only, as you mentioned, I've always tried to wonder what was first, or what should be first, to develop bicycle urbanism and develop the bicycle culture in cities around the world. Is it the infrastructure that should come first and then people follow? Or you should rather say that the first is the mindset of people, that they start treating bike as a normal transportation tool. And once they start to bicycle, then comes the infrastructure, so that the policymakers are kind of aware that people love to bike and they provide the infrastructures.
Yeah, well, we always say that there's sort of three main things that a city needs to focus on to start moving towards a bicycle-friendly city. And that is infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. That you can't actually have people feeling safe and comfortable cycling in your city until you have infrastructure. And it's the infrastructure that actually creates the culture. If you look to Dubai, for instance, or Germany, they have wonderful car cultures that they're world famous for. But the reason they have those wonderful car cultures is because they have wonderful highways. Same if you look to Paris or London, there's this sort of very special, very unique metro or underground culture. That is only because they have very far-reaching and effective underground networks. It's the infrastructure that creates the culture. And it's the same with cycling here. There's nothing, like I said earlier, there's nothing particularly Danish about the bicycle. Depending on who you ask, it was invented in Germany or Scotland or Russia. It's not necessarily Danish by any stretch. It's because you have this infrastructure that makes cycling safe, comfortable, and an attractive choice. You have people cycling. And not only do you have people cycling every day on the way to work, as you know, probably 49% of all trips to work or school are by bicycle, but you have also all these other things that pop up. You have cargo bikes. One of my favorite things about living here in Copenhagen, a quarter of all families here have a cargo bike. And it's a great way of moving your friends or your children or your furniture, what have you, through the city. And because the infrastructure is there and because it's wide, you can actually feel safe doing so. And you're not interrupting the flow of other cyclists most of the time. It also encourages things like cyclogistics. You've seen here in recent years a number of cyclogistics companies pop up with these wider 3 or 4 wheel cargo bikes that are delivering food and delivering other packages in a more sustainable way through the city. And the reason that these businesses like this can thrive here, again, is because you have the infrastructure. So all this culture around cycling in Copenhagen, the gentleman riding in a suit, the deliveries by cargo bike, children going to school by cargo bike, that's only possible because we have the infrastructure that is far-reaching and connected throughout the city.
I totally agree, because I was a delivery courier myself, and I couldn't find better place to do it than here in Copenhagen. And it was because of the infrastructure. And to follow up on that, I was just wondering about this infrastructure. So the infrastructure is being developed and it attracts the people. But what if it is the early stage of the bicycle urbanist development in a certain city? I would love to use the example of Warsaw, because there are a lot of bike lanes that were built in the recent years. And you could say that biking is being more and more popular. There was a very successful bike rental program in the city. But still, sometimes the bike lanes, they are not connected. They are not kind of continuous bicycle networks. So sometimes it would just end and continue on the pavement, on the pedestrian sidewalk. So how to avoid this confusion in different cities? Because I just can imagine that if someone starts to bike and there is this infrastructure, but it is incomplete, it is very easy to be to just give up on that idea and be discouraged. So what would be this kind of first step for a city that wants to be more bike friendly, but maybe they lack this approach or experience, or maybe sometimes it's about money and they lack the funds for providing the citizens with a coherent bicycle network. And instead they are just starting with bits and pieces here and there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common challenge that a lot of you could say, startup cycling cities are facing. And it goes back to that earlier comment I made about seeing the bicycle as a legitimate mode of transportation. You wouldn't do a subway system with 2 stops in the northwest corner of the city, 2 stops in the southeast corner of the city, and 3 stops in the northeast corner of the city. That wouldn't be a subway network. That wouldn't be an effective way of moving people through the city. It would be a waste of money. And it's that same line of thinking that you need to take to cycling, that a network is always important. it has to be a connected network reaching throughout the city, and that each new project you build has to connect to something else. Otherwise, it's just, it's going to end up discouraging the cyclists. It's going to end up discouraging and putting off the people that don't cycle now, but may be interested in doing it. And it's also going to annoy a bunch of drivers. So you actually have, in the end, something that the whole sort of movement towards being a more bicycle-friendly city, or having more mobility options within the city, becomes less politically feasible because you're pissing off people from all sides. The cyclists don't have faith in the new infrastructure, and the motorists are getting annoyed because the roads are becoming more confusing. These new users jumping in and out of traffic because they got nowhere else to go. Oftentimes when people complain about cyclists not behaving correctly or behaving properly or behaving recklessly, it's because the infrastructure treats them recklessly. So if a bicycle lane ends all of a sudden mid-block, they're on their own. They have to figure out what to do. And maybe that means jumping up onto the sidewalk or continuing mixing with car traffic. But in any case, it's not going to be ideal for any of the road users. The pedestrians, the cyclists, the motorists, public transportation operators, it's just going to make for a mess. So it really comes back to thinking about taking that network approach really from square one and focusing on all future growth on connecting into that network. And another important factor that we always talk about for cities that are in the early stages is to start collecting data as soon as you can. Whenever you have a new project, count the number of cyclists before and after the implementation of that corridor or that intersection redesign to really show that this is actually paying off, that people are starting to cycle here because of this. And then, collecting that data, but also communicating it to a wider audience, communicating it to the public that, hey, this is what we've done and this is how it's working. So, for instance, one of our favorite examples is the Canadian city, actually, of Calgary. This is in Alberta, Calgary, Alberta, which is where a lot of the oil comes from in Canada. And this is a very car-oriented province. And they were toying with the idea of doing over 5 years a pilot project on 5 different corridors. And the mayor at the time put in a lot of political capital and said, why don't we just do all corridors at once? And so they did that, but they studied it. And they collected the data throughout the whole process. So then they're able to say, okay, we've done this to the public, and it has resulted in a 30-second longer car trip through the city center. It has encouraged, X number of new cycle trips, 60% of which are now women. It has resulted in an increase in women choosing to ride a bicycle, indicating that it's a safer infrastructure. So they look to a series of data points and told that story to show that this was actually worth pursuing and that we've achieved many sort of desirable factors within the city with this pilot network. So it's making sure you had that data throughout the whole process, before and after the infrastructure. And that can go a long way in telling the story to the public, but also to media. Because when you have that data, you can make a much stronger argument, and you can also, therefore, continue to invest in more infrastructure.
So far, we discussed the importance of infrastructure and as well the importance of data as those two anchor points for developing the bicycle urbanism. And here I'm very curious about your working methodology and the process, because my whole idea for this talk was that Copenhagenize means to bring a piece of Copenhagen somewhere else, as some piece of the solution that is out there. But as we already mentioned, and I'm very happy that we did that, we should avoid copy-pasting, and it's rather not possible to just copy it one-to-one. So how could we transfer those ideas? How do you transfer the ideas, the assumptions from Copenhagen, and try to apply it in different places all over the world, but still without copying them?
Yeah, like I said earlier, we're not trying, when we say Copenhagenize, we're not trying to exactly copy-paste the city of Copenhagen into New York, into Montreal, into Toronto, into Perth. That would be boring, if not impossible. We just can't do that. We acknowledge that. But there are a lot of elements here from Copenhagen that can work anywhere, really. This notion of having a connected network of separated, safe cycling infrastructure is not necessarily something Danish and not necessarily something that would only work here in Denmark. It's almost as if saying, to say that, but that's Copenhagen, that won't work here. Well, that's just short-sighted and not very creative, actually. That's not a very good way to approach a problem, right? Because if you look at different modes of transportation, the car has been adopted to work around the world, whether we're in the desert or in the tundra. Sidewalks, we have sidewalks in Barcelona, we have sidewalks in Bogota, we have sidewalks in Texas to a certain extent. Yeah. So as I said earlier, the approach of just copy pasting Copenhagen to any other city, it just won't work. Not only would it make a really boring result if every city in the world was Copenhagen, but it's also just frankly impossible. You can't copy paste a city like that. But that's not to say that there aren't things here to learn from and that can transfer quite nicely to other cities. So like I said earlier, this concept of the connected network with protected and dedicated infrastructure, that has been proven here in Copenhagen as a concept, as in a few other cities, but that can also apply in cities all over the world. So, a lot of cities are finding success implementing networks of connected, protected infrastructure, and it's served them quite well. You're seeing a result that is an uptake and people choosing the bicycle because all of a sudden they feel safe and they feel that it's a practical solution. So cities like Montreal, cities like Paris, of course, is the big example, that they are building these networks. They're treating the bicycle more and more as the legitimate mode of transportation, and they're seeing results. And so how we approach this sort of challenge when we work internationally is that we're starting with these main themes of a connected network that is protected and safe and intuitive. And so from there, then we start to analyze the city that we're working with or the area that we're working with. We meet with residents. We meet with different stakeholders. We understand their perspectives on what works and what doesn't work in the city, where they feel safe, when they don't feel safe, where the attractive destinations are and whatnot. Also looking at different factors within the existing network of city streets, whether that's the connectivity of the cities, whether that's the connectivity of the streets themselves, or perhaps it's the topography of the city, looking to particular streets that are more comfortable, less than a 5 or 3% grade, even better. And sort of once we get all these factors, we sort of stack them all together, you could say, and then a network starts to take shape. And then the next step then is the politics and the implementation. So then we also work with the client or work with the city to identify how this will be implemented, which streets we should prioritize first, why, looking to different range of functions, whether there's the level of modernization or whether there's a certain number of on-street car parking there that is working or isn't working, or whether there's other sort of really prickly points in terms of local politics. And then we work with we develop an implementation plan to help the city or whichever scale of client we're working with start to roll out the cycling infrastructure with that end goal of having a network of safe, connected, protected infrastructure. I've actually had the good fortune early in my career of working with a project, working with a client that was one of these unheard of wild success stories. It was this town in Russia called Almatyevsk. Maybe you've heard about it. Maybe you've read about it. So it's this town in Russia, in the region of Tatarstan. You could say southwest Russia. And with this case, the mayor there, a relatively young, more progressive mayor, wanted to be the most bicycle-friendly city in Russia. And I should say that there's not much competition for that title. You could really literally just build a really small basic network and you'd take the gold medal. Nevertheless, he actually listened to everything we recommended, and he built a network of now over 100 kilometers of protected cycling infrastructure. And, we were there for a couple of visits during the process, and we heard a lot of pushback, especially from the transportation engineers, that this won't work here. Russia's different. Russia's not Denmark. Russia, we have winters here. It's too hilly here. It's too dirty here. It's too whatever. There's millions of excuses not to change the status quo. But nevertheless, the mayor was very persistent, and he really pushed them to follow through on this vision and this idea. And we visited a year after the ribbon cutting. And to be honest, when I was driving to the city from the airport, I think we were all quite nervous in the car, thinking oh crap, what if this didn't work? What if Russia really is different? What if it was too cold, too hilly? What if the bicycle just isn't part of the Russian culture? They're just not interested in it. And so we're thinking, oh no, what are we going to tell them next? Build more. But luckily, as we drove into the city, there's a cyclist and another one and a family and another one and another one and a group of friends and another one. And sure enough, residents of Almatyevsk had started cycling. And it was just this wonderful moment, not only for the project, but for me professionally, that we're working with something that actually that works. It was a moment sort of, we could recognize that, of course, the political processes are wildly different around the world. It's much easier to build 50 kilometers plus of protected infrastructure in Russia than it is perhaps in Germany. But the end product is something that's been proven now, that when there is a connected network of protected, safe infrastructure, people will start cycling, no matter the culture. And that was really, I've been really fortunate to have that professional experience early on in my career to really drive my belief in this, that I can sort of continue to have the enthusiasm to work with really challenging contexts, whether we're in Dubai or in Ecuador or in North America. Of course, one of the most challenging contexts to really believe that when you have a network of cycling infrastructure, people will start cycling.
To add one more example, we already mentioned Bogota and the ciclovia that is happening out there. And it's not very complicated, right? It's just closing the car traffic for one day and it's giving the space back to the bikers, to pedestrians.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that goes back again to this question of what comes first, the culture or the infrastructure. This is sort of in a different way, but this culture of street life and people enjoying the public sphere comes from the very lightweight infrastructure of closing down the streets for once a day. And that sort of infrastructural change, really in terms of policy, not so much of, heavy infrastructure changes, really shone a light on how people want to be and experience their city.
I think that was very important what you said. Speaking about this Russian city, when you said that you just went there and luckily all the solutions, it worked. And before we also talked about that you are straight from the beginning of the process, you are kind of aware. And I guess you also want your clients to be aware as well that you will not build the second Copenhagen in their city. But don't you think that still the mayors, the clients that also want to work with you, they kind of still hope for that they will have some piece of Copenhagen in their cities? Like, I just can assume that maybe this mayor of this Russian town, he really wanted to have Copenhagen to be there because Copenhagen already has this PR effect of positive impact of bicycling. So how would you meet those expectations of people?
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, I think mayors, they love their city. By their very nature. They're champions of their own city. And what sets them apart maybe is the vision for what their city can become. So whether that's more public life or maybe that's more mobility options, there's different places they can look for inspiration. And it's not just Copenhagen. Of course, there's many cities around the world that can be a source of inspiration. One of my favorite anecdotes about learning from other cities actually goes back to Paris in the 1700s. If I can rewind a little bit and go off on a bit of a tangent, you might be familiar with Pont-Neuf, the bridge in Paris crossing the river. And this bridge was actually something rather new at the time. It was one of the first bridges built in Europe where it wasn't financed by having shops or stalls on the perimeter, on the edge of the bridge. So what this meant was all of a sudden it opened up a whole new view to the city and to the river as well. They also designed in sort of these bays of benches so people could stop and socialize and spend time in public space on this bench. But for me, what was most interesting actually about this whole story was that it was a case where they actually decided to separate the different road users, separate the different bridge users, you could say. So they through a grade separation, through a vertical separation, they put the pedestrians up on one level and then the carts and the horses and whatnot down on another level. And there's this sort of brilliant aha moment that, oh, wow, we never thought of that. And cities actually from across Europe, politicians from across Europe, delegations from across Europe started going to Paris to see this one bridge, Pont-Neuf, and how they've come up with this genius way of making a more efficient flow of traffic through this one corridor. And that actually led to many European cities starting to build what we now know and take for granted as the sidewalk, as the pedestrian pavement. And it actually led to I think it's called the Westminster Pavement Act in the UK in the 1800s. I can't remember exactly the date. But I mean, I like to bring up that story because it really shows that, learning from different cities is nothing new. You really got to look abroad and further afield to see what other cities are doing and what other cities are finding success with. And also at the same time, what aren't working for other cities to really start to improve your own city. And I think that's what a lot of our clients sort of a lot of our clients touch into the same sort of sentiment that we got to learn from one another, no matter where it is in the world.
To summarize it a bit on a positive, successful note, before our talk, we also mentioned that the cargo bikes. And I think that this is also one more important topic that I would love you to share some thoughts about, because cargo bike is also something that is not such a new invention, but it just became very popular recently, especially in Copenhagen. But also we talked about Polish city of Gdynia, which is very successful if it comes to introducing or maybe reintroducing the cargo bikes So what is of the cargo bikes nowadays in creating the bicycle urbanism?
Yeah, cargo bikes have really proven themselves to be a sort of very flexible and very adaptive tool for urban living and urban commerce even. Especially with, people over the last 10 years in cities around the world starting to cycle more and more, or maybe living a car-free life. The cargo bike has sort of stepped in to fill this role, and it's been really encouraging to see. Of course, here in Copenhagen, we both live here. We see every day how flexible and how awesome the cargo bike is. Like, you see so many different things by a cargo bike here. One of my favorite stories is seeing somebody purchase a dishwasher from an appliance store here in Copenhagen, and him and the salesperson actually walked the dishwasher out and lowered it onto his Christiania bike. They both sort of looked at it with a sense of satisfaction and waved goodbye, and along went the guy with his brand new dishwasher on the front of his cargo bike. And then you also see people, of course, riding with their kids together, riding with their friends, riding with a sofa sometimes. You really see how flexible it is. And that's been great. We've actually been working with a project recently called City Changer Cargo Bike. So it's a European funded project under the Horizon 2020 grant scheme. So we've been working with cities all across Europe, including the city of Lisbon, the city of San Sebastian, the city of Oslo, and the city of Gdynia in Poland. And it's been a really fun, super inspiring project where we've been sort of tasked with promoting the use of cargo bikes among families and businesses in Europe. And so with these awesome different partners, these different municipal partners, we've had a lot of creative solutions on how we can get cargo bikes out to the people. And so what Gdynia has done is a lot of really cool initiatives. They've started a financing scheme where the city will actually finance 50% of the ticket price of the cargo bike up to a certain level. And that's been successful. That's been very popular. They also have a small fleet of cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes, that residents and citizens can rent for a short period of time. And actually, what's really cool about that initiative is that 60% of the people renting these cargo bikes are women. It's been a really successful initiative that really showcases that cargo bikes are not something, for the middle-aged man in Lycra or the gearhead that's sort of super passionate about bikes, but it's for everybody. They also, as a municipality themselves, have been purchasing cargo bikes to use for everyday tasks that the city has to do. They've been starting to implement standards for cargo bike parking within the city. So, of course, bicycle parking is a big issue in many contexts, but so too is cargo bike parking, because they have a few small different needs compared to the conventional bicycle parking. So they've also been welcoming that to Gdynia. And then at the same time, they too have been sharing their knowledge. They have been part of this knowledge transfer phenomenon where other cities in Poland can hear of what has worked in Gdynia and what hasn't worked, and how they can also facilitate cargo bike usage in their cities. So overall, the City Changer Cargo Bike project has been, a pleasure to work on and to see the impact it's had in cities in Europe. And, to know that it's not just this odd Copenhagen thing anymore, this Copenhagen phenomenon, but it's something that can truly work in many different contexts.
To be honest, I'm very proud. I didn't expect that here in Copenhagen, talking about Copenhagenize, I will hear that the Polish city is a role model if it comes to bicycling, or especially the cargo bike. So I'm just extremely happy about that. And it just makes me proud. And it shows me that, I think, just to conclude, and also as we mentioned a couple of times already, that it will work in many different cities, in many different contexts. If you provide the right thinking, the data, the infrastructure, the people will just come and will use it, and the culture will be created. So I think that this is just a very important aspect. And that would be my conclusion. What would be your conclusion to this conversation?
Yeah, I think just sort of to wrap up this conversation is, recognizing that cities are all in different places. And they're in different steps along this journey, you could say, to becoming more bicycle friendly, and recognizing that and keeping these core themes in mind. If they can remember to keep in mind the idea of intuitive, connected, safe infrastructure, to collect the data before and after any big projects is also very important. And recognizing that the bicycle poses many different solutions to a lot of problems facing our cities. Whether it's public health, whether it's air quality, whether it's traffic congestion, the bicycle and also the cargo bike, of course, can solve a lot of these problems, and is a very flexible and relatively affordable way of addressing these problems in cities. And also not to be overwhelmed by the scale of this challenge. Not every city is, a European city with this relatively small footprint. A lot of cities that we're working with, whether they're in North America or what have you, are really sprawling. And that means that there's, it can be really overwhelming in knowing where to start. But that doesn't mean that the bicycle doesn't fit into that size. Just for the same reason that in sprawling cities, we have sidewalks, we have pedestrian pavements. It shows that it's worth building this infrastructure. So just, starting somewhere and making sure that you start with a network and then building out from there.
It totally makes sense. It's a good introduction to my last question, which is like this more additional one, more again on this personal note to come back to the roots and the beginning of this conversation. I just wanted to ask you for a book recommendation that the listeners could just dive into after listening to this conversation. Would you have a good book? Would be nice if it was about the topic.
Yeah, I think there's, if I could recommend maybe like 2.5 books. I say half because I haven't read one of them yet. But one, it's really relevant to urban mobility, and that is Fighting Traffic by Peter Norton. And this is really a deep dive into the transformation that North American, particularly US cities went in moving from human-centered cities in the early 20th century to car-centered cities later in the century. And I think it's an awesome book that really dives into not only the technical and the engineering process of that transformation, but also the social transformation here and how we actually use our city streets completely shifted within a century. So that book definitely recommend checking out. But then if I can sort of, look to another book that's a bit more romantic, stepping away from the topic of mobility, perennial favorite of mine is Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. And it's just this sort of wonderful, fantastic story of a traveling merchant recounting all these cities he's encountered in his travels. And it's just very poetic and beautiful. And I think when you read those, you can maybe draw some sort of parallels to cities that you've visited or that you live in or that you've encountered in your own travels. And then the next one, my half recommendation, and I say it's only half because I haven't read it yet, but I have just ordered it, is Autonorama. It's again by Peter Norton. And it's just looking to this, this utopian vision that we're all being sold about the future of the autonomous car and sort of picking that apart. So I really look forward to getting that in the mail and diving into that one.
Thank you very much, James, for those recommendations and also for sharing your knowledge behind the bicycle urbanism from here at Copenhagen. But as we also talked, it is the experience you also got in all different parts of the world, especially in Russia, which was very inspiring. And I hope that we also managed to encourage the listeners to dive into the topic of bicycle urbanism and to basically get to know that there is the big importance of the infrastructure to make our cities more bike friendly. So thank you very much for our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to finally catch up with you. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you for listening to the newest conversation with James. I think that he mentioned many interesting things and I would like to quote a couple of things, but maybe I will just stay with the one quote and say that to answer this question of infrastructure or culture, what comes first in creating the bike-friendly cities, James answered that there is this infrastructure, and infrastructure that creates the bike-friendly cities and everything else follows. If you like this conversation, I would like to invite you to follow my podcast on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or just leave me a review. You can do it both at Spotify and also at Apple Podcasts, and I will be very, very thankful for that. To conclude our discussion, there is actually one more very interesting initiative by Copenhagenize, which is the Masterclass, which is a 3-day immersion in bicycle urbanism here in Copenhagen. And I think that actually it will be the best if James will say something about it himself. James, the floor is yours.
Knowledge transfer between cities, between different contexts is, so important for us. You can hear it in the name, Copenhagenize. Learning from one another. What can you learn from Copenhagen? And that's why we also host these masterclasses in bicycle urbanism. So with our masterclass, we got one coming up in June here in Copenhagen. We have 20 to 30 people from all around the world to come here to learn about what makes this a bicycle-friendly city. And so we have people, we have politicians, urban planners, architects, advocates from all different fields come here to Copenhagen for 3 days of talks, tours, guest speakers, workshops in sort of really diving into what makes Copenhagen such a bicycle-friendly city. And then they go home and they bring their learnings with them. And it's great to see over the years, we've been doing this since 2016, to see how these sort of our alumni, you could say, of this course have sort of brought their learnings to their hometown, whether it's in Japan or in Belgium or in the US. Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the job, just to welcome people from all over the world and just showcase what works here, why, and hopefully point them in a way that they can identify the transferable aspects and bring it home with them.